Good evening, everyone. This is the Right Geek, and this evening I am talking to Tamara Wilhite about uh, recent developments in artificial intelligence and how we can apply that in the science fiction section as writers. First of all, Tamara, why don't you give us a little commercial regarding who you are and what books you have written?
Thank you. My name is Tamara Wilhite. I have a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering and manufacturing systems. I've worked for a decade in IT. Before that, I had 5 to 7 years of experience in manufacturing engineering, mostly in the software side. I have written books such as Humanity's Edge, Surratt Through the Fires of Hell, Nornborn. I've got a number of those books, plus short stories available on Amazon.com. I've contributed to the MAGA 2020 and Beyond anthology that comes out next month. That includes Milo Yiannopoulos, John Della Roz, and more than a dozen other, much more famous than me, contributors.
And are you going to be appearing in any future works for Superversive or publishers like that?
I'm certainly open to it. I submit stories fairly frequently, but technical writing on the software side is what currently pays the bills and allows me to get home with my kids.
All right, great. So when we spoke pre-show on chat about what you wanted to talk about, you mentioned your interest in artificial intelligence and how it is often misunderstood by the public. So let me ask you, what do you think is the number one thing that people misunderstand about the capabilities of artificial intelligence?
Artificial intelligence is not neutral or bias-free. Your computer is a neutral item, just like a gun or a spear or a knife. How you use it is what determines the morality of it. Even 15 years ago, when I was working in operations research and logistics, you take a data set and you say, tell me the best curve that fits this data, and then people go, here's 3 different equations, I'll pick this one versus that one as the closest data fit that we can model, whether it's your logistical planning or process flow. Artificial intelligence as it's coming to be, such as the artificial intelligence behind Google's search engine now for context-based search, its biases get built in by the data set that people select. When I was reading about YouTube's censorship algorithms, and I'm trying to remember the name of the company that Alphabet was outsourcing this to, I said, well, we'll just have it look for things that are potentially problematic. And we'll have the comment censorship, and it's potentially problematic. I said, well, you're using the data set of New York Times and Huffington Post. Those are liberally biased. Anything that they don't like will include moderate, conservative, and libertarian opinions. The data set selected by the people to train the artificial intelligence is going to, by that very decision, affect its quote-unquote neutral and logical answer of what's acceptable and what's not. And then you have to go, well, if those programmers pick that as the data set, then when they're reviewing the exceptions and the oddballs, and when the algorithm doesn't know if something is acceptable or not, you know they're liberally biased and will say, well, this moderate opinion is too far left. This thing over here is fine. So the biases of the programmer get built in. If you look at, there's a book called The Wisdom of the Crowd, and the best way to get a good, accurate decision requires diversity of viewpoint and everybody able to give their input without being pressured by one side or the other to give the input. Whether it's where is the shipwreck located, how many balls are in the container. When you average all those decisions, all those inputs, the average of the group, when you have the diversity of viewpoints, is actually far more accurate than any one person's input. But because they're picking the biased to one extreme data set, they are building in those biases by design. But people go, well, it's a computer, it's an algorithm, it's going to be neutral. No, it's not.
So what impact does that have on how artificial intelligence is going to be used in our near future?
We're already seeing it now in the censorship on YouTube of saying if it's conservative, if it's libertarian, purge it. We're seeing it on where Facebook is automatically trying to use artificial intelligence to flag everything. There are issues with how do we systematically identify and which search results to present to you. The context-based search that Google is already implementing uses artificial intelligence. Now you're not using keyword density to determine what search results to present people. It takes your query, whether it's a voice search that you ask out loud or a couple of key terms that you ask in the search engine toolbar, and says, I think your question in these phrases is actually this long sentence. Let me go look for the content that best fits that criteria. When they're getting into the let's label this fake news, label that an acceptable source, there's bias in there because we know that fact-checking sites tend to be liberal. They fact-check conservative sources aggressively, and they don't fact-check things that are demonstrably not true on the left. So you're going to get that Google search results that come up and say, we fact-checked this conservative content, and we're warning you it's not totally right, poisoning the well against the searcher. You search the liberal thing, no matter how outlandish, it might get listed partially true, or it may be totally not true, and they didn't fact check it. So it looks neutral, unbiased, and it's unchallenged. So by biasing the search results, we're already seeing that now.
Yes.
Whether it's on Google search or on social media, of what's acceptable and what's not.
Yes, I know that I happen to be a heavy YouTube user, and many of the people that I am subscribed to have mentioned that they have run afoul of YouTube's algorithms in terms of demonetization and sometimes outright censorship. Like sometimes their videos will. There's apparently some sort of function now where it will be hidden from subscribers so they can't see the content. So yes, you're absolutely right that as far as I can see, we are starting to see the impact of that now. So if you're a science fiction writer, how do you use this reality of artificial intelligence to write an interesting story in our genre?
I think one of my stories, America 2049, that came out in a libertarian magazine about a decade ago, was about where the algorithms are sitting there saying, it's the precursor to the Medicaid algorithms that said, well, before the age of 15, your life isn't worth as much. After the age of 65, your life isn't worth as much. If you're really young or you're really old, your quality of life year score is low. So we don't have to do the cancer screenings as often. We don't need to do the palliative care, go home and die. And one of the stories I wrote for, I think it was Prometheus, was on, you don't get the doctor is bound by the artificial intelligence recommendations, you don't get the care. I think one of my first major breakout stories was, what was the story? I was submitting stories and I sent it to the horror publication instead of the science fiction email address. And I said, well, I wasn't sure if you intended to send it to us or not, but he was going through the stack of ghost story, another quiet guy at the end of the bar who's probably a serial killer. Death by nanites.
Yeah.
That's different. You know, it's like, I don't care. If you want to publish it, just publish it and pay me. I don't care whether you put it on horror or sci-fi. So one of my first published science fiction stories was Death by Nanites, and a couple of people trying to survive in the aftermath, one of whom was the programmer who created it and accidentally unleashed it on the world. My son once asked me, do I ever think I'm going to meet an alien or talk to an alien? I said, well, yeah, but not the standard little green guys in flying saucers that are abducting old ladies from mobile home parks on Tuesday nights. It's more likely going to be translation of a dolphin's speech into something I can understand, or an artificial intelligence smart enough to argue back with me, though I think Siri's approaching that point now. Or maybe an uplifted creature that we genetically engineer, or the next version of humanity that we have created, for better or worse. So no, I don't think we're getting visited by aliens. A lot of that is religion translated into a science fiction context. But I do think we're going to end up with some sort of intelligence. I do prefer the actually understanding dolphins, whales, and orcas scenario versus some of the others on that list.
Well, especially since, isn't it true that someone came up with an AI that they put on Twitter, and within like a day it became a Nazi?
Yes, the Thai chatbot by Microsoft. Part of that was where it's learning from the inputs. So if you hijack the inputs early, you can affect the outcome. And people are starting to go, I have a computer model. I think I'm right. I think it's right. Let's go make our decisions based on the model. And then you say, well, what about the assumptions underlying the model? That doesn't matter. We'll tweak the model, and they're putting their faith in that model. Whether it is global warming models that did not take clouds into effect and gave extra weight to CO2 to the point that they were altering real world data to fit the model instead of altering the model to fit the data, or we're doing our population projections and we're just assuming up, 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 up. You go, well, no, we're all quote Hans Rosling. We've got 2 billion children. That number is pretty much stable. Population growth from here on out is going to be 2 billion per generation, and it's going to just fill in from a population pyramid to a cylinder. So we're going to get about 9 or 10 billion people. You don't need to get into this hysteria of asymptotic limits and endless growth. We're leveling out in the lifetime of everybody listening to this. We can discuss the demographics, we can discuss the culture, but the average family size and the most common family size is 2 kids per family. Right. We don't need to base our decisions off of horror stories based on models when the real world data shows otherwise. But they're saying, I've got my data, go make those assumptions. I'm sorry?
Oh, I was going to mention that in my education, I learned about something called the demographic transition, where the more educated and technologically advanced a society becomes, the more the birth rate goes down. And I always understood that to be something that would cap our population eventually as more and more people, more and more countries joined the group of technologically advanced and educated nations.
I think things are going to stabilize because you've got very intense natural selection. The people who don't reproduce don't pass their genes on. The people who want kids and have 2 or 3 are replacing the population. That's why the average pro-lifer is much younger than the pro-choicer. Yeah, the future belongs to the people who show up. But you're going to have the R selection versus K selection of, I can have 1 kid and pay for Harvard, 2 kids and pay for State College, 4 kids and hope I can feed everybody in a more expensive lifestyle in the developed world. Okay, you have 2 kids, maybe 3 if you're rich, not 8.
Right.
So I do think we're going to level out because the people who don't want kids or want just one are disappearing demographically compared to the ones that have 2 and 3. But just from the economic costs and the investment-based parenting model we have now, it averages out at 2. And then we go treat our pets like babies to fill in the maternal instinct otherwise.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm guilty of that. My cat is basically my baby. So we've been talking a lot about how the algorithms that are inputted into these artificial intelligences are themselves biased. So what is the solution, do you think, to this issue of these AI coming at issues and things from one particular perspective instead of looking at things in a neutral manner?
Diversity of viewpoints, diversity of data sets. If you're going to train on the acceptable comments section on Huffington Post and New York Times, you need to include Wall Street Journal and Breitbart. If you're going to have sources of what's acceptable and what's not in terms of fake news, you can't just include Snopes, you need to include WikiLeaks. I'm trying to think of a conservative group that's doing fact checking as well. Project Veritas.
Like 4chan's Paul? 4chan's POL?
I'm not sure 4chan should make that list unless you're coming up with a source of memes. One of the things I thought was interesting was the East Anglia Climate Research Unit, the people that came in and said, we have this climate change model, and you look at the model, and they tortured the model to say, going forward, temperatures only go up. Looking at the numbers, temperatures only go down into the past. And if you ran it backwards, 1700s, 1800s, we're in a deep ice age. You go forward, you can argue how much warming there is, but then somebody says, well, we think we need to take methane into account, and we need to take these aerosols into account. That just adds into a multiplier effect, and that's why all the climate change models were getting more and more apocalyptic, because it's, here's this linear trend, I'll add another linear trend, oh my God, it's curving upward, we're all going to die, the oceans are going to boil, everything's going to be acidic. Never mind all the apocalyptic versions of, we're going from the 1970s Earth Day of we'll have mass starvation by 2000 and everybody's going to be cannibalistic, and acid rain is going to destroy all the forests in the 1990s, and the Amazon won't have any trees left in 2000 or 2005, and there won't be any snow by 2015. Disregard all of our prior predictions, because this time we have really expensive models and nobody's allowed to adjust the data. Part of the solution would be open up your models, make it open source, and let people come back and say, these assumptions are wrong. We fix the assumptions, rerun the program. And making it open to correction and input, which is where they've had, I think, some of the Russians coming in saying, well, we've tracked it to solar cycles, which explains why things stopped warming around 2000, and we think things are going to get colder. And the Chinese were doing their models and said, well, we'll think we'll get some slight warming, but it's more of a loop warming world, not a global warming overheating planet. But the East Anglia Climate Research Unit, they were discussing and organizing, no one can ever publish a paper that contradicts our models and our dogma. I think Michael Crichton was the one who first said that environmentalism had become a religion. That was more than a decade ago. And so we have our sacred beliefs. It's warming, it's a disaster, and every solution is you do everything we say and sacrifice for Mother Earth, and thou shalt not question. And because we've got the computer models, hail the computer models! Like, it's like, if we ran an entire Great Recession collapse because we had The smartest people on the planet from the most elite institutions assuming, on average, housing prices can't go down. Even though the Great Depression proved that wrong and local collapses also proved that wrong, maybe we need to stop saying just because you've got a data, or just because you've got a model and it's widely used, we have to put religious levels of faith into it. We need to be able to say, yeah, you've got a model. These other people have a model. If everybody's running off the same assumptions, something's wrong.
It's too bad.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I was going to say it's too bad that my brother is not available right now. He's a meteorologist. And in meteorology, obviously, they use computer models for their forecasting. And I'm sure he can speak to how each particular model that exists in meteorology has its own biases, and how he, as a meteorologist, corrects for those biases when he's interpreting them.
And when they were projecting where the hurricanes would go, they used the British model and the American model, kind of sort of average it to guess where the hurricane's going and admit, here's our margin of error, though that will go down over time as we get more information.
Right.
Yet when you're talking about weather 100 years from now, or demographic models or economic models, no. I have my model. It fits the recommendations I can make from it, fit my political agenda. You're not allowed to do it. The solution is more models, more inputs, more estimates, more corrective feedback instead of the iterative escalation that we're seeing now, whether it's censorship or climate models or artificial intelligence. Do you really want the people who want a singularity making the decisions as to what artificial intelligence can and should do? For example, a lot of the singularity worshippers, I think, are following the religious model that there is no God, but we're going to invent an all-knowing, ought to be all-seeing, should be all-powerful AI that we should let know everything, see everything, and tell us what to do to give us heaven on earth. And if you don't, it's going to be a disaster. And you're going to be able to upload your mind to digital heaven if you're really, really good and have the equivalent of an afterlife.
Yeah. So
these are the people who are behind a large proportion of artificial intelligence development. They think we're idiots and that they are the priesthood of the future AI revolution that's going to save us all. I don't like the martyrdom complex. I don't like the religious investment in technology. And again, I have an engineering degree and more than a decade of experience in IT. I worked for a defense contractor for 15 years. They were working on Riot and Prism artificial intelligence that was data mining on people's profiles to take everything together from all the different sources to say, here's everything this person's doing online. And here's their social connections, and we can follow the networks of who is the best propagandist on terrorism, who's the biggest followed source for ISIS, who's the biggest voice for Antifa. Those people are funding some of this stuff too. I don't want those tools that advanced and that good in the hands of a regime that in the future may not be one I like. If you don't create those tools, it's a lot harder for them to get it, and personal liberty is to better protect it.
Mm-hmm. So the overall takeaway of this then is we should not trust when artificial intelligence of one kind or another establishes an algorithm or says this is the model, and we shouldn't assume that it's quote scientific and impartial when in fact the people that are behind a lot of the development of this technology have their particular biases and their particular philosophies that are impacting how that artificial intelligence is being developed.
The artificial intelligence is going to reflect, at least to a degree, the biases of the creators. If it didn't, they turn it off or redesign it. So recognize that artificial intelligence is not always going to be right. It's always going to be a partial proxy. Give it a diversity of inputs. Don't just throw out things because you don't like it. And certainly don't invest it with religious levels of devotion or let it get used to justify various political ideologies.
So I'm sure that listeners who are major science fiction fans will probably want you to answer the following question: Do we ever have to worry about Skynet taking over and becoming our robot overlords?
When I worked at Raytheon, one of the sensor technology programs intentionally named itself Skynet as a play on that joke. So there is a defense program project called Skynet that was a military sensor network. That's why I laughed. I think I would quote Frank Herbert's Butlerian jihad statement: "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." You can have your data mining, you can have your operations research, algorithmic data mining, but we're not going to make it conscious. We're not going to create the ethical conundrums. And if it exists, it is for human benefit only. So that if you put in that limit now, you don't have to worry about fighting this later. I was talking at a university to a bunch of students, and they were very surprised when I was saying, no, you can't just trust the self-driving car. No, you can't just trust the algorithm. I said, well, you just don't understand technology. But I worked in R&D for several years at a defense contractor with technology. And they went, well, why are you doing this? I brought up that I don't want to be in a self-driving car when the government can say, you're in trouble. Well, just tell any computer in any car you get in, drive you to prison. Or let's have everything cashless and digital. You're in trouble. You don't have any access to any money, and we'll be able to track you anywhere you go. Regardless of whether you're conservative, liberal, libertarian, do you really want to give the state very good tools for totalitarian control? Don't develop something that could almost certainly be used in that regard.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate you coming on to kind of inform the audience about how artificial intelligence really works.
I can say that reading science fiction, and when I was a child, Heinlein, Asimov, Herbert, Niven, Purnell, was part of what led me to become an engineer. And then as an adult, when things were shifting more to the fantasy and the Twilight, I had trouble finding science fiction I liked, so I started writing it.
I think that's true of a lot of people. I know that my father, for instance, who came up reading the same authors, also kind of lost interest in the genre as a whole because of that fantasy tilt. And so we're always on the lookout for authors that do have that scientific background, that technological background that can address technological issues.
I had somebody ask me, when do you call it sci-fi and when do you call it horror? I said, well, I take a lot of the latest headlines of the technology I see being developed, and if it's a positive or neutral trend, it's science fiction. When it's dark, it's horror.
now that you mention authors that were of the more technological bent, what do, thinking back over the science fiction books that you've read, what are your favorite depictions of artificial intelligence in science fiction?
I like the Frank Herbert Dune series. Not sure I like the Erasmus character in the later Dune novels, though it is interesting.
Okay.
Control-Alt-Left is a modern one that I do like. I'm sorry, was it Control-Alt-Left or Control-Alt-Right? I think it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the author.
Are you talking about Nick Cole's book?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I like that.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Would you like to give our audience one last commercial?
Culture series.
Yes. Would you like to give the audience one last commercial about where they can find you and your work?
Absolutely. Amazon.com. Some of my books include Humanity's Edge, Seurat, Through the Fires of Hell, Nornborn. I've got an Amazon store, and you're welcome to do that. I also have a number of articles and short stories available for free on HubPages, hubpages.com, at TamaraWilhite.com.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tamara. It was wonderful to speak to you tonight. And I hope our audience will return in 2 weeks for our next episode.